The restaurant wasn't loud, but it was full. The kind of evening where every table mattered and every mistake felt bigger than it was. She moved carefully between guests, balancing plates and timing, reading the room the way experienced servers do. At one corner table sat a customer who seemed distracted from the moment he arrived, scanning the room instead of the menu. When she greeted him politely, he barely responded, already signaling impatience without saying a word. She took his order slowly, repeating it back to be sure everything was clear. He nodded, eyes still wandering, and waved her away before she finished speaking. It wasn't unusual, but something about the exchange stayed with her. Not tension, certainty. She wrote a small note beside the order, a habit she'd developed over time when a table felt rushed. It wasn't for protection, it was for clarity. When the food arrived, the customer frowned almost immediately. He examined the plate, then looked up at her as if something obvious had gone wrong. He said the order wasn't what he wanted. His voice wasn't raised, but it was firm, confident, like there was no room for discussion. Nearby conversations softened slightly. She listened without interrupting, letting him finish before responding. She apologized and calmly explained what she had written down. That only seemed to frustrate him more. He insisted she must have misunderstood and suggested she hadn't been paying attention. She didn't argue. Instead, she offered to fix it and asked one simple question, whether he'd like it remade or adjusted. He waved his hand, clearly convinced the situation was already settled in his favor. As she turned toward the counter, something changed. Not in the room, but in the direction of the story. She didn't feel embarrassed or upset. She felt certain. Certain that the truth was written down. Certain that clarity would matter more than volume. Behind the counter, the manager was already reviewing orders for the evening, unaware that one small note was about to quietly shift the balance of the entire situation. At the counter, she explained the situation carefully, not defensively. The manager listened while scrolling through the order system, then reached for the printed ticket. She pointed to the small handwritten note beside the order, neat, precise, time-stamped. It wasn't dramatic, but it was exact. The manager paused longer than usual, rereading it once more before glancing up at her. Without saying much, the manager stood and straightened his jacket. He didn't look annoyed or rushed, just deliberate. As he walked toward the table, the restaurant's rhythm slowed slightly. Conversations dipped, forks paused mid-air. Not because something loud was happening, but because something decisive was. The manager greeted the customer politely and placed the receipt on the table between them. He explained that the order had been prepared exactly as requested and that the note confirmed it. His tone wasn't corrective, it was factual calm. The kind of explanation that didn't invite argument, only acknowledgement. The customer glanced at the receipt, then back at the plate. His certainty faltered just briefly. There was no scene, no raised voices. Just a pause long enough to change the direction of the moment. The manager offered to remake the dish anyway, emphasizing that the goal was fairness, not blame. When the manager stepped away, the table felt different. The customer sat back, quieter now, no longer confident in the assumption he'd arrived with. The server returned moments later, placing a fresh glass of water on the table. Nothing was said, but the balance had already shifted. The customer no longer spoke immediately. Instead, he watched her quietly as she moved through the dining area, checking on other tables with the same calm efficiency. Each step seemed effortless, but every movement carried the weight of experience. She wasn't showing off, she simply knew her role, and the small truth she had preserved in that note had already started to reshape the perception at the table. A few diners nearby noticed the subtle change in the corner table. What had seemed tense and uncomfortable moments ago now felt restrained, almost respectful. The shift wasn't loud or obvious, but it was noticeable to anyone paying attention. The quiet authority of preparation had quietly overtaken arrogance, and the room carried a softer rhythm as a result. She returned to the counter briefly, jotting down notes for the next table. The manager gave her a small nod, almost imperceptible, acknowledging her professionalism. There was no praise, no dramatic declaration, just recognition in a glance, but it carried far more weight than words ever could. The small note she had written earlier had quietly defended her. When she went back to check on the customer, he finally spoke. His voice had softened, no longer dismissive, no longer confident. He asked a clarifying question about the dish, carefully, almost cautiously. It was brief, almost awkward, but it was the first time he had acknowledged her presence as someone who mattered in the situation. She answered politely, calmly, with the same attention to detail she had maintained from the very beginning. Nothing theatrical, nothing forceful. Yet the effect was undeniable. The customer's attitude had shifted completely, not because of confrontation or shouting, but because facts, care, and quiet competence had spoken for themselves. The shift continued naturally. The customer ate his meal without complaint, occasionally glancing at her as if re-evaluating the assumptions he had made when he first arrived. He wasn't loud or apologetic. He simply acted differently, with a subtle respect that wasn't demanded but quietly earned. Nearby diners returned to their own conversations, unaware of the silent exchange of acknowledgement that had just occurred. But for the server and the manager, the evening had subtly shifted. A single moment of patience, attention to detail, and integrity had changed the balance of the room entirely. After she finished serving the table, the customer gestured a brief thanks, short, almost reluctant, but unmistakable. She nodded politely and continued her work, never letting the small recognition inflate her ego. Her focus remained steady. The job was not about winning, it was about doing it right. The manager, watching from the counter, gave her a small smile of approval. Not dramatic, not public, just a quiet acknowledgement that her professionalism had prevented what could have been a tense, uncomfortable evening. Sometimes the most meaningful victories aren't loud, they're measured, subtle, and lasting. By the end of the night, the restaurant had returned to its normal rhythm. She tied her apron, reflecting briefly on the evening. No confrontation, no humiliation, just preparation, calmness, and clarity. And in that, she had accomplished more than anyone at the corner table or anyone watching could have expected.